Hi, Shirley. Well, in theory, politics are not supposed to play a part in this. But the bottom line here is every New Yorker knows that Mayor Zohran Mamdani campaigned on a rent freeze.
So, as New York's mayor gets ready to freeze rents on millions of apartments, some people, and that would be landlords, are sounding the alarm. Because while apartments can cost an average of $5,000 a month, certain buildings find themselves underwater because their rents are already regulated by the iron fist of the communist state, which the mayor wants to use as he attempts to fulfill a campaign promise to freeze rents in these buildings entirely, which, as you're about to see, will create the worst housing crisis in New York City history.
It would hurt everyone. It would hurt the tenants. It would hurt the owners. It would hurt the city.
Small and medium-sized landlords, especially those with buildings built before the early 1970s, told the Rent Guidelines Board they can barely afford to keep up their buildings as is. They say everything is more expensive, from insurance to property taxes to utilities.
The rent is already too high.
We're facing three crises of ICE deportation, wartime inflation, and cuts to the social safety net.
Last year, landlord profits were up 12%.
I'm freezing your rent.
Mayor Mamdani made it a signature issue in the campaign, insisting landlords can weather a rent freeze.
Buildings with rent-stabilized apartments saw their revenue increase by more than 6% last year.
Why would anybody move here now when they see a video like that? Why would somebody of wealth who wants to build a business here or bring a hedge fund here, why would they want to come here if this guy's just going to come out with a machete and cut you off at the knees? It's amazing.
So 40% of New York apartments are already in the clutches of socialism. And look at this. Some of these buildings that are full of them, they're selling for 90% off. And what nobody's talking about is New York City is already eating itself for breakfast. And after it freezes rents entirely, there ain't gonna be nothing left for lunch. Because while the mayor got elected on promises to cap rents, the buildings where these apartments are located, they're already pretty much worthless. And if a building becomes 100% worthless, nobody's gonna spend the money to take care of it because the money to do that's not gonna exist. And then the place is gonna fall down and become a pile of rubble nobody can inhabit, making our housing crisis worse. But that's not the only reason a rent freeze is a wallet-busting, unaffordability nightmare hiding in plain sight. Sure, you have some buildings that are so bankrupt nobody wants them, but you've got others where there are a mix of properties. Some are regulated, others are not. And while New Yorkers overwhelmingly voted for a mayor who said he was gonna freeze your rent, not every New Yorker's gonna benefit from this. In fact, people living in free market apartments next to their rent-regulated neighbors are gonna be in for a shock when the landlord has to raise their rent because he can't touch the rents of people who just got a handout from the mayor. Which brings us to the real reason this rent freeze might be the worst thing to ever happen to New York City housing. It's gonna make everybody's life worse while it does something else, which is even worse. Because when you see a building lose all of its value and sell at a 90% discount, the property taxes the city can collect on it won't be what they used to be. And we just heard from the mayor how he might need to raise property taxes on the middle class to pay for all of his free stuff, which means after the rent gets frozen, the people of this city are gonna be paying for that one way or another, which means New Yorkers are about to get a crash course in exactly how destructive communism can be.
It would hurt everyone. It would hurt the tenants. It would hurt the owners. It would hurt the city.
Small and medium-sized landlords, especially those with buildings built before the early 1970s, told the Rent Guidelines Board they can barely afford to keep up their buildings as is. They say everything is more expensive, from insurance to property taxes to utilities.
So the whole argument here about why we need to freeze the rents is because these are the greediest people on the face of the earth and they're just out there ripping everybody off. And obviously, that's not true. These people, they've got these buildings and they're full of regulated apartments and they can't make enough money to maintain their own buildings that they invested in. Now, does that sound like a good investment? If it costs more to maintain the thing that it's actually bringing in? I don't think so, and this is a disaster. But don't worry, the communists have a plan to save landlords in this position.
To the extent that Mayor Zohran Mamdani has argued the city has resources available for landlords in distress.
These programs exist on paper, but in practicality, when housing providers actually put the pen to paper and try to submit applications, the amount of bureaucratic red tape and distinguishing factors on who's eligible and who's not weeds 90% of the people that need these programs.
Wow, so the city's got plans and programs in place to help you if you're a struggling landlord and your building's about to fall down. But the problem is those programs don't work. And you know why they don't work? Because the city has no place getting involved with housing. Did you know New York City's actually the biggest landlord in the entire country? They've got 6,000 vacant apartments in their public housing buildings that they can't seem to find the money to renovate. You know why? Because their communist system that taxes everybody to pay for everybody else isn't working there. It's not working here. And this is about to get a whole lot worse, and nothing is going to save these property owners. And it's sad to watch.
Mayor's office tells me the city is working to help landlords, launching just last week a new city-backed insurance program, plus supporting reforms to tax rules that would make it easier for landlords to make repairs. Plus, the city helps preserve roughly 16,000 units of housing each year.
Okay, that's what they say. They can say that all they want. The costs to operate these buildings keep going up, and if you're going to freeze the rent and bring down the income, eventually we're going to be here. Some buildings are already here. And now what? If the city wants to help these landlords, it's very simple. They can roll back some of the laws they've passed that make it unaffordable to be a landlord. But they don't want to do that. That is not how communism works. We never roll back laws. We just stack new ones on top of each other, and then we come up with new programs, because that way the government is both the cause of and solution to everything going on here, you see? And you want to know why these buildings are selling at a 90% discount? It's not just that the rents aren't enough. You got some renters living in these regulated apartments. They don't even pay. They can still stay. Look at this. Insurance hikes are a problem. And then you got this chronic non-payment of rent. You could stay in these apartments without paying rent for months, sometimes even years. Now, yes, New York City has housing court, and yes, the leases people sign might say they agree to pay for the place and they agree to pay for damages, but anybody who's been to housing court in New York realizes that the same judges that are releasing violent repeat offenders over and over again, they've got the same attitude as the judges in housing court that see a bunch of lawless tenants destroying a building and say, well, these greedy landlords deserve it. Nobody ever gets justice in housing court except the renter, and sometimes the renter walks away with the justice that's due the landlord because they live in a place for free and never have to pay for it. And that's why these buildings are going bust. And at the same time, there are other laws out there that make it even more expensive to run these buildings that the communist overlords of New York have zero problem with.
Exploding insurance costs is threatening the future of New York. And last week, I had testified before the New York State Senate to talk about this very issue. We shared new data from 60,000 apartments, and it's brutal. Insurance premiums are up 113% in the last 5 years, and up 134% in the Bronx and Northern
What's doing that?
Some buildings are paying over $3,300 per apartment just for insurance, and it's getting worse. New York City is #1 for questionable slip and falls, even with video proof showing the claim is false.
Oh, look at that. So it's not just the communists that walk down the street in New York and see a building and say, hey, I see a dollar sign. Let's take that. You've got criminals doing the exact same thing, walking around getting injured on properties where their actions are recorded, and you've still got insurers paying out these claims, because when this goes to court in a city that hates landlords, the landlords always lose. Now the insurance is going through the roof, and this just adds to every single thing the city is stacking on top of property owners. Did you know that property owners also have to pay for all the water being used in these residential apartments? Look at this. Last year, the cost for water coming into buildings went up 3.7%, following an 8.5% increase. Look at that. This adds all kinds of costs to operating a building. This is bad for landlords because it's essentially a hidden tax. And it says right here, in a rent-stabilized apartment, the landlord can't pass that along to the renter. So you got people living in rent-stabilized apartments using unlimited amounts of water that the landlord has to pay for it. Once the rents get frozen in these buildings, it's not gonna make sense to even operate them. I actually know somebody that started a greenhouse, and they were living in a rent-stabilized apartment, and they had a greenhouse with a whole bunch of plants in there that they were selling on Facebook Marketplace. They got all the water for free. The landlord was subsidizing their business.
16,000 units of housing each year. Mayor Mamdani himself has been careful to say he respects the independent process of the Rent Guidelines Board, but stands by many tenants in his belief there should be a rent freeze for 2 million New Yorkers in rent-stabilized housing. Several of those tenants testified as well Thursday, saying they can barely afford to stay in the city because of rising costs of, well, everything.
We're facing 3 crises of ICE deportation, wartime inflation, and cuts to the social safety net.
Last year, landlord profits were up 12%.
Okay, but not in buildings that are full of rent-regulated apartments and are being sold for a 90% discount. Profits aren't up in those buildings, and if you freeze the rent, the ones that are profitable, nothing happens to them. And then this individual says that ICE deportations are bad for the rental market. Well, if there's folks living in apartments and they're not supposed to be in the country and they're here illegally, and then something happens and they're not allowed to live in those apartments anymore, now you have empty apartments which someone could move into, and that actually helps bring down rent. So I don't know if these people fully understand what they're talking about. Wartime inflation, that's also temporary. We shouldn't freeze rents permanently because of a temporary situation that's going to resolve itself.
6 of the 9 members were appointed by Mayor Mamdani. So will they help him keep his pledge to freeze the rent? Here's Eyewitness News reporter MJ Burkett.
Are you kidding me?
With New York City rents rising to historic levels, the Rent Guidelines Board is facing unprecedented pressure to hold the line on the 40% of apartments that are rent regulated.
The rent is already too high.
The board heard from tenants like Emma Rehak, who shares an apartment with 2 roommates in Upper Manhattan and spends 30% of her income on rent.
Our landlords' incomes are not in crisis. It is our housing, our basic need for shelter, that is in crisis.
I mean, this couldn't be further from the truth, and this is the testimony. Obviously, we can look at the numbers of a building and see if the income's in crisis or not. If you've got a building where the rents are here and the expenses are here, that's a crisis, and it's not a crisis for the renter. It could be a crisis for both the renter and the landlord, but the government certainly isn't going to solve that by picking a favorite and either capping the rents at a level that caused the landlord to go out of business or letting the rents to go up to a point where everybody becomes homeless. The government is not the solution here. These individuals, this whole process ignores the solution. Everybody that's living in one of these apartments should be all about the idea that landlords build more buildings. You've got to increase the supply. That's the thing that nobody's talking about here. That's the thing that nobody wants to do. And because we live in a communist regime where business owners are the enemy and millionaires are the enemy, the last thing they're going to do is let a bunch of private property owners come in and redevelop these empty lots and turn these into places people could live. Because you know what? That would solve a problem and make somebody rich. That's what capitalism does. Capitalism's evil. Can't have that. So this is what we get. And with the mayor basically stacking the deck, appointing all of the people to this supposedly independent board that is going to decide whether or not rents should be frozen or not after listening to both sides of the story and making an impartial decision. I think we already know what that decision's going to be, don't we?
I'm freezing your rent.
Mayor Mamdani made it a signature issue in the campaign and later made good on his pledge to appoint half a dozen members of the 9-member board.
Yeah, they're going to freeze
insisting
this.
landlords can weather a rent freeze.
Buildings with rent-stabilized apartments saw their revenue increase by more than 6% last year.
Oh, but that doesn't matter. He says revenues were up 6%. Anybody who's ever run a business understands that to figure out how much money you're actually making, you've got your revenue, then you got your expenses, which for some of these buildings are higher than the revenue, and then you have the bottom line, which is a negative number for some of these buildings. Also, look at how politically smart the mayor was. He says right here in his little video, I'm freezing your rent. That video was seen by millions of people who voted for the mayor because he said he was going to freeze your rent. But what if you don't live in a rent-stabilized apartment? This video doesn't make any mention of that. He says he's going to freeze your rent. People went out and voted for it, and some of these people, they're living in an apartment next to somebody else whose rent's going to get frozen, and then their rent's actually going to go up. They don't understand that by voting for communism, they just voted for redistribution because here they are in a market rate apartment which they can afford, and guess what? More will be expected of them so that other people can have things a little bit better. You see, that's how communism works.
Increased by more than 6% last year.
But the board also heard from landlords who are struggling with rising costs like fuel oil and insurance.
One thing we can say for sure, the trend is alarming. Insurance has increased by well over 100% in the past 5 years.
The war in Iran has dramatically increased our fuel costs.
Jose Tour owns a 45-unit building in Washington Heights, purchased in 1979 by his grandfather who emigrated from Cuba. His profit margin is less than 10%.
That's wild. So he's making less than 10% on 47 units. There goes the myth of the rich, greedy, evil property owner that is living large while everybody else suffers. This guy's making probably less money than some of his renters who are busy complaining about his rent and are about to get a rent freeze. That's wild. Also, if he's operating on a 10% profit margin, that means if his apartment empire generates $1 million a year in rental revenue, he keeps $100,000 of income. That's not enough to live in the apartments that he's renting to people. So he can't even live in his own building if that's what he's making. And now landlords are supposed to fix their buildings. They got to pay for all the water. They got the rising insurance. They got the slip and falls. They got all the crime taking place outside of these places that creates excess fines because you got people littering and throwing garbage all over the place, which landlords then have to clean up. I mean, this whole thing is a nightmare for anybody who's achieved anything, and that's likely on purpose.
You feel like you're fighting a losing battle?
It definitely feels that way. Right off the bat, I know, and it feels like we're the underdog, and we have to fight every day for our interests.
Because he's the enemy.
Do you have any sense of how it's going to go?
I hope that if they are very serious about addressing the affordability crisis in New York, they're going to decrease our rent because the rent is already too.
Okay, so this woman testified that she spends 30% of her income in rent, which is a lot. But look at this. According to this 2023 study, she's doing better than 30% of New York, a number which has only gone up since then. People are spending half their income on rent. If anything, she's one of the rich people, and she should be expected to pay a little bit more because she's doing better than other people. You see, she's one of the fortunate ones. She says the rent's too high. Actually, for her, it's not. It's higher for somebody else. And communism is going to look at that and make sure that something gets done about it. And people in this situation that are living in a free market apartment, they are not going to like the answer to that. And this is the first time in their lives they're going to find out what the answer to that is from communism. But I hinted at this earlier. The government has no place trying to solve this problem. All they can do is pick a winner or a loser. They can either decide to freeze rents and now the landlords lose, or they can let the rents go up and now the renters lose. The situation that benefits everybody is to bring more apartments into the equation. That's the external source right here. That would mean that these landlords, if they want to build new buildings and offer more housing and make more money, they have the ability to do that. If they want to run their crummy old buildings and do absolutely nothing and be lazy and greedy, well, somebody else is going to come along and put them out of business. And these renters that are spending too much money, the best thing for them is options. They don't have any options. That's why they're prisoners to these terrible apartments that in some cases are never going to be renovated because the money to renovate them's not there. Everybody is a prisoner to this failing system. What do you think about that? See you in the next video.